If you have your Bibles, you can open them to the book of Proverbs. And we'll be diving into chapter 6 this morning, looking at verses 1 to 11, though we won't get through all 11 verses this morning. But chapter 6, verses 1 to 11. Some practical life lessons can go a long way in helping young people, and really all people, prepare for a better future. And two of the more practical areas that young people could always use some help in are finances and work. Finances and work. Young people often lack financial prudence. That is, they don't always make the best financial decisions. And again, even adults don't even make the best financial decisions. We're financially naive and inexperienced. The management of money, investing and borrowing, lending, budgeting, saving, forecasting is in many ways foreign to us. There's a learning curve for some of those things, and some people are just very slow to learn or don't want to learn at all. And it's not just a lack of financial prudence, the poor management of money, but also an indifference towards work. Young adults sometimes fail to see the value of hard work. They're not always eager to enter the workforce and persevere in that 9-to-5 job. The thought of working by the sweat of the brow, exerting tremendous effort and energy to earn an income, well, that isn't always a pleasant thought. It's tedious, it's taxing, and sometimes the mindset is that it's just too much to handle to actually work 9 to 5. This generation, maybe more than previous ones, doesn't enjoy getting their hands dirty. In other words, there's a real proclivity to laziness, a propensity toward idleness. Slothfulness is a huge problem. Many have the mindset and even the expectation that I should be able to work little and make much. Isn't that the mindset of the generation that we live in? Work little, make much. Your earning a living should be quick and easy. And so what you see happening with young adults are these self-inflicted economic consequences because of poor financial decisions that are being made and as well as a poor work ethic. They're not planning and preparing well for the future. Interesting enough, Solomon will now address those two areas with a young son here in chapter 6, verses 1 to 11. He doesn't want to see his son make poor financial decisions by getting entangled in a bad business deal. And he also doesn't want to see him come to poverty by failing to have a strong work ethic. Solomon is trying to protect the future well-being of his son. He wants him to make wise financial decisions and at the same time cultivate a strong work ethic. And to do both of those things, well, that would secure a better future. Solomon has a few basic lessons on financial prudence and hard work. Look at what he writes in Proverbs 6, verses 1 to 11. He says, "My son, if you have become surety for your neighbor, have given a pledge for a stranger, if you have been snared with the words of your mouth, have been caught with the words of your mouth, do this then, my son, and deliver yourself, since you have come into the hand of your neighbor. Go, humble yourself, and importune your neighbor. Give no sleep to your eyes, nor slumber to your eyelids. Deliver yourself like a gazelle from the hunter's hand, and like a bird from the hand of the fowler. Go to the ant, O sluggard, observe her ways, and be wise, which have no chief, officer, or ruler, prepares her food in the summer, and gathers her provision in the harvest. How long will you lie down, O sluggard? When will you arise from your sleep? A little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest. Your poverty will come in like a vagabond, and your need like an armed man." And so somewhat of, when we just read it at face value, somewhat of a random section, but as you'll see, not so random at all. But here in Proverbs chapter 6, verses 1 to 11, Solomon has two pieces of practical advice that will help his son secure a better future. Two pieces of practical advice that will help his son secure a better future. In verses 1 to 5, that first piece of practical advice, Well, Solomon is going to tell his son, don't be liable for the debt of others. That's essentially the main point. You don't want to be liable for the debt of others. And then the second piece of practical advice in verses 6 to 11, don't be lazy in the duty of work. Don't be lazy in the duty of work. We'll cover the first one this week and then the second one next week. Before we get into that first piece of advice, let me just show you the connections between these two sections, between verses 1 to 5 and 6 to 11. Solomon ties these two sections together by using some of the same terms, and this is why I think these sections should go together. I could have, created an outline for both of them, but I just went with one outline. But just look at some of these same terms. For example, in verse 3, and then again in verse 6, he uses the word go. Go. He issues a command. Verse 3, go, humble yourself, and importune your neighbor. Verse 6, go to the ant, O sluggard, observe her ways, and be wise. Solomon's basically saying it to his son, you need to take the initiative. You need to be proactive. Take action. Do what needs to be done as you prepare for a better future. Don't be apathetic or indifferent. Move in the right direction. Go. He also uses the words sleep and slumber in both sections. Verse 4, give no sleep to your eyes, nor slumber to your eyelids. Verse 10, a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest. Both sections, Solomon doesn't want to see his son drag his feet, to procrastinate, to put off doing something, to be inactive, apathetic, indifferent, lazy. Don't be lazy is the point that he's trying to get across. And then finally, in these two sections, Solomon uses illustrations from the animal kingdom to exhort his son. Verse 5, he uses the gazelle and bird. Deliver yourself like a gazelle from the hunter's hand, and like a bird from the hand of the fowler. Verse 6, he uses the ant. Go to the ant, O sluggard, observe her ways, and be wise. Solomon's point is that there are lessons to learn that you could learn from the animal kingdom. Wisdom can be acquired through the observation of certain animals. Behave like them in certain instances and situations. Look at how they fight for freedom when they're ensnared and entangled in a situation. Notice how they flee from danger and observe their fervency and work. Solomon says animals act in wise ways when caught in certain situations, and it would be wise to imitate their ways. And so in these two sections, verses 1 to 5, 6 to 11, there are some clear connections. These aren't just random lessons that Solomon pulls out of a hat. They're not unrelated. They have been placed side by side and serve to complement one another. Well, with that being said, let's now look at the first piece of advice that Solomon has for his son. Don't be liable for the debt of others. Don't be liable for the debt of others. And he starts by stating the foolish situation that a son might find himself in. Look at verses 1 and 2. He says, my son, if you have become surety for your neighbor, have given a pledge for a stranger, if you have been snared with the words of your mouth, have been caught with the words of your mouth, do this then. And then Solomon will go on to provide the solution in verses 3 to 5. But before we get to the solution, let's just understand the situation. Solomon says, at some point, son, you may become surety for a neighbor or have given a pledge for a stranger or to a stranger. What does Solomon mean by surety? Surety is not a word that we hear too often, but it is a practice in the world of borrowing and lending. And to become surety means that a man is willing to pledge himself as a guarantee for another person's debt. A man is willing to pledge himself as a guarantee for another person's debt. It refers to a person who takes responsibility for the debt or the default or other financial obligations of another person. Or you could say it like this: a person accepts the responsibility to pay a moneylender back if the borrower of that money fails to pay. And so it's basically taking on another person's financial commitments as one's own, like when a person co-signs a note to pay another person's loan. That's what Solomon means when he says, if you have become surety for your neighbor. You made an agreement with your neighbor to pay his debt. If that is, he doesn't pay or he can't pay at some point in the future. And then Solomon says this in the second half of verse 1. And if you have given a pledge for a stranger or to a stranger. That phrase, give a pledge, literally means to strike hands together or to clap the palms. This is equivalent to our modern day practice of shaking hands, or better yet, the modern day practice of signing on the dotted line. Put your signature right here, because now that it's in writing, you're bound to this legal arrangement or this legal agreement. It signified pledging oneself as collateral in a business arrangement. Two parties struck their hands together and a legally binding deal was made. An agreement was sealed, probably in the presence of a witness or two or many witnesses, just to validate the agreement. Now, what you need to know about verse 1 is that there are three parties involved here. The surety, so think about what the surety is. That is the person who assumes responsibility for paying a debt if the original debtor fails to pay. And in this case, that would be Solomon's son. That's who he's warning. Then you have the neighbor, the man who took out a loan or borrowed money. He is the original debtor. And then the stranger, who is likely the money lender or the creditor, the man who lent money to the one who is called a neighbor. And so in order to help a neighbor out, the surety, again, Solomon's son in this case, and the stranger strike a deal. They strike hands. The surety agrees to pay the debt of the neighbor if he defaults on his payments. And the stranger, the moneylender, accepts that pledge. Now, I understand that might be a little bit confusing, so let me just illustrate it this way. Let's just say that you and your neighbor walk into a bank because your neighbor needs a loan. He wants to borrow some money from the bank to get his business off the ground. He wants to open a pizza parlor, we'll just say, because his pizza recipe is the best in town, so he thinks. And it's not like there's a pizza shop on every corner. Another pizza place is needed. And so your neighbor has this ambitious business idea. The only problem is that he needs a loan to get his business off the ground. And so you and your neighbor head to the bank. He sets up a meeting with the bank manager, and then he says to the bank manager, I would like to borrow $100,000 for my business, for my small business. At that point, the bank manager says, okay, well, let's start the loan review process, because it's not like he's just going to go in the back, get $100,000, hand it over to the man. No, we need to have a loan review process. We need to run a credit report and look at your credit history. We need to see how you've managed your credit in the past and if you've made consistent payments. Obviously, this is how it would work in our day and age. We also need to look at your current monthly income and compare it to the financial obligations you have. In other words, we need to calculate your debt-to-income ratio. We also need to review your collateral. That is your personal assets, such as a car or a house or a savings account that you might have, and how much money you have in that savings account. Do you have personal possessions and property that could be used to repay a loan if the business doesn't succeed? We then want to know what the loan will be used for. What's the nature of the business? What is your business idea, your great business idea? We want to know if there's a good chance of your business succeeding, because if the business isn't successful, then, well, we may never see our money again. And so the bank manager takes all those factors into account during the loan review process, and even maybe a few other factors. And then he runs his report, and then he comes back to you, and he says to your neighbor, we've completed our review, but it's not very promising. It's not very encouraging. Your credit report is bad. Your monthly income is too low. You don't have any valuable collateral, no car, no house. What you have in your savings account is pretty low. And quite honestly, we don't think that your business idea, well, it's a good idea at all. I mean, there's a pizza parlor on every corner, so not a very good idea. But then he says this, the only way to secure a loan from our bank is if you have a co-signer. You need a person who agrees to be legally responsible for your debt if you fail to pay. Someone who signs this loan with you and is then legally liable for your debt. Someone who's willing to be surety is the word that Solomon uses. Well, at that point, your neighbor turns to you and says, because you're sitting there with him, you went into the bank with him, will you be my co-signer? Will you sign for me? Will you be my surety? I know this business will be a raving success. I know it's not going to fail. Please, will you co-sign for me? Will you promise to pay my debt if I can't pay? But don't worry about it. I will pay it. I know how to pay it off. And he turns to you and he says, well, what do you say? And maybe along the way, he gives you those puppy dog eyes so that you feel bad for him and you feel his situation and you feel sorry for him. Well, since you are a compassionate Christian and have a genuine interest in helping your neighbor out, you say to him in the spur of the moment, without really thinking it through, of course I will. I'll be surety for you, become your surety. I would gladly pledge myself and all that I own as a guarantee for your debt. I'll take on that responsibility. I'll assume that liability. I'm more than happy to help you out. Where do I sign? And so you, your neighbor, and the bank agree to these terms. Your neighbor gets the loan. You're responsible for his debt if he can't pay. And the bank is happy because one way or another, they're going to get their money back, either from your neighbor or from you. Now, of course, that's not the exact situation that Solomon describes here, but it's very similar. The surety is the co-signer, the son whom Solomon is warning. The neighbor is the borrower, the original debtor. And the stranger, more than likely, is the money lender, the bank in my illustration. But here's what Solomon does. Here's what Solomon says. He warns his son that if he ever finds himself in a situation like that he has made a grave financial mistake. A grave financial mistake. To be surety for a neighbor is not a wise financial move. There are tremendous risks tied to it that could negatively affect, well, yourself, your home, your family, and maybe even your future. Why would you ever place yourself in that kind of financial predicament and take on that kind of financial responsibility? Solomon understands that his son, or maybe any Christian in our context, may want to help out a neighbor, support him, back him, be generous to him. This isn't the way to do it. Don't make yourself liable for another man's debt. Don't put your entire future at risk by co-signing a loan, especially one where you could lose everything. It could cost you everything. This is just foolish financing, terrible stewardship of one's wealth, an unwise money move, and it could result in long-term, lifelong consequences. Don't be surety for your neighbor. Just so you know, this isn't the only place in the book of Proverbs where Solomon warns against doing something like this. Just listen to some of these other passages. Proverbs chapter 11, verse 15 says, "He who is guarantor for a stranger will surely suffer for it, but he who hates being a guarantor is secure." This verse is slightly different and in many ways worse than Proverbs 6, verse 1, because in this verse, a man becomes surety or a guarantor for a stranger. He doesn't even know this person, someone random, someone potentially untrustworthy, or someone that he doesn't know all that well. Why would anyone do this is beyond me, but Solomon says, if you pledge to pay another man's debt, if he fails to pay, that is, then you're bound to suffer for it. You've put yourself in an unwise financial predicament. You've lost financial security for the future. Proverbs 17:18 says, "A man lacking in sense pledges and becomes a guarantor in the presence of his neighbor." And so here we see again, it just lacks sense. It's illogical. It's irrational. A man is not counting the cost when he makes an impetuous, impulsive decision to be a guarantor in the presence of his neighbor. And you can kind of almost envision this. Go back to my illustration. Your neighbor turns to you and says, "Will you please be surety for me? Will you co-sign?" And in that moment, in the presence of your neighbor, you say, "Of course I will. Absolutely." Not thinking through the consequences. Proverbs 20 verse 16 says, "Take his garment when he becomes surety for a stranger, and foreigners hold him in pledge." The emphasis here is more on the consequences of becoming surety for someone. Solomon basically says a man will lose the shirt off his back, potentially. Even his garment will be taken away. He'll end up losing everything, down to the very clothing that he wears. Co-sign for the wrong person, an unreliable person, it could cost you life's essentials. Proverbs chapter 22, verses 26 to 27. "Do not be among those who give pledges, among those who become guarantors for debts. If you have nothing with which to pay, why should he take your bed from under you?" Again, to be responsible for another man's debt is just foolish, especially when you don't have the resources to pay it back. That's just ridiculous. That's just dumb. Why would you co-sign when you have limited resources yourself? You could end up losing everything, even the bed that you sleep on, Solomon says. And so over and over again, Solomon warns against being surety for a neighbor. Don't make yourself liable for another man's debt. Don't put your entire future at risk by co-signing alone. And more importantly, and this seems to be the real issue, don't do it impulsively and rashly. Don't make a careless, thoughtless commitment like this. That's what Solomon seems to stress next. Look at verses 1 and 2 again. He says, "My son, if you have become surety for your neighbor, have given a pledge to a stranger." And then he says this, "If you have been snared with the words of your mouth and have been caught with the words of your mouth." Solomon is now describing how his son got himself in this financial predicament in the first place. His mouth got him in trouble. He opened his big mouth without thinking about what he was signing up for. He spoke rashly, recklessly, carelessly, imprudently. The phrase, "the words of your mouth," they're used twice, highlighting the fact that these are hasty words. And that's what put him in this predicament. His neighbor may have said, "Well, please be surety for me." And he quickly said, again, "Of course, absolutely. Whatever you need me to do, I'll help you out." Never thinking through the consequences. Solomon says, you were snared by the words of your mouth, caught by the words of your mouth. He's using hunting terms to describe this situation. Snared refers to setting a trap to catch prey. A snare is something that catches an animal, putting its life in danger, something that even destroys the life of an animal. And then caught essentially carries the same idea. It refers to being captured and imprisoned, which then, of course, endangers the life of an animal and possibly even destroys life. Solomon says that's what your own mouth did to you. You've done this to yourself. Your own mouth put you at risk and in danger. Your own mouth set a trap for you, putting you in a financially destructive situation. Your own mouth took away your future security, your financial stability. You didn't think before speaking. Your mouth messed up. Maybe you thought you were being kind and generous and helpful, but that rash act of generosity may very well cost you dearly in the end. You wanted to be the hero. You wanted to come alongside your neighbor. You wanted to save the day, and instead, you might have just ruined your own life. Solomon wants his son to be prudent with his finances. Carefully think through what he's investing in, or carefully consider what he's signing up for. Don't be a gullible, naive young man who lacks judgment and then impulsively signs up for something that may have financial consequences, and then it affects your future well-being. Don't get entangled in co-signing a loan because of a poor poor business discretion or poor discernment. You need to think through the financial implications of something like that before you speak. If you agree to cover, say, tens of thousands of dollars that is owed to a stranger, a bank, for instance, because a friend or a family member lacked the financial character to pay their debt, well, it could severely impact your life for the future. And so the warning that Solomon gives in a nutshell is, don't promise to pay back money other people have borrowed, especially if you don't have the funds. Don't promise to pay other people's debts. You may be sorry. Don't make a rash financial decision and get entangled in someone else's financial obligations, because it could come back to bite you. Solomon is wisely addressing matters of finance with his son. There's a way that God wants him, or even us, to manage our money. There's a way to manage your money to prevent a future crisis or financial predicament. And this is one of those ways. Don't be surety for your neighbor. At least not impetuously. Do it rashly or impulsively. Now, all that being said, let me just say this, because you might be thinking about this. Does this mean that you or I should never co-sign a loan? Should you never help a family member, a brother, a sister, a sibling, a parent by adding your name, your credit profile, your collateral to a house loan or an auto loan, for example, or agree to be legally responsible for their loan amount? Is that something that you should never do? Nope, not going to help. Well, no, not necessarily. You could be surety for a family member, but before you commit to doing something like that, there are some things to consider. And I'm just going to give you a number of things to consider, practically speaking. Again, think about Solomon's situation, or Solomon's son's situation. He did this rashly. He did this impulsively. His mouth put him in that bad situation. So consider these things first. Consider the character of the person you're co-signing for. You want to co-sign? You want to help somebody out with their house loan or their auto loan? Consider the character of the person you're co-signing for. Is this person trustworthy? A person of integrity? Is he or she honest, truthful, reliable? Does he or she have a strong work ethic? And do they even have a full-time job? Because if a person is lazy, then that character flaw should give you pause. Or if a person is untrustworthy, unreliable, dishonest, deceitful, then don't even consider co-signing for someone. It would just be unwise. So consider the character of the person. Number 2, consider the consequences of co-signing. Consider the consequences of co-signing. Understand the risks. Have you mentally prepared yourself to lose money? To lose a lot of money, because that could happen. Can you afford to lose the amount of money that the loan is for if, in fact, a person defaults on their payments? And not just that, but can you afford to lose a relationship? It could drastically affect your relationship with this person. Because sometimes when co-signers are stuck with a loan, that damages a relationship. Do you understand that your credit is on the line? One missed payment or multiple missed payments by the original debtor could affect your credit score. Will co-signing put you or your own family at risk? Your future stability, financial stability, and financial security. You need to consider the consequences of co-signing. Not just that, number 3, consider a person's course of action before co-signing. Consider a person's course of action before co-signing. In other words, how does this person that you're going to co-sign for plan to pay back their loan? How will they make their monthly payments? Have a good understanding of their plan for repayment. I mean, you want to have some assurance that you won't be stuck with another person's debt. Consider a person's course of action. Number 4, consider a person's collateral. Consider their collateral. What do they have? A lending institution. Will they consider a person's collateral? Why shouldn't you? Is a person flat broke, doesn't have a penny to their name? It's not going to be wise for you to co-sign. Take on their financial responsibility. Do they have any assets, property, possessions? If so, then do you really want to assume responsibility for the entirety of a loan if they don't have those things? Consider a person's collateral. And then finally, number 5, just practically speaking, consider some counsel. consider some counsel. Maybe ask a financial advisor if this would be a wise move, or even ask a pastor or other people that you trust. If you're thinking about co-signing for someone, involve others in this decision. But whatever you do, don't do what Solomon warned against. Don't make a rash, impetuous, impulsive decision out of pity for a person. And that seems to get us in trouble a lot, right? As Christians, we're compassionate, we're generous, we want to help others out financially. We see their financial burdens, we see their financial difficulties, and we have pity on them. And it's like, of course, I'll do whatever you need me to do. And then maybe it comes back to bite you and damage your family or hurt your family or even, your future stability. Don't quickly commit to being surety for someone. Think through all of those things. And so I think there are some things you can do to protect yourself if you're thinking about, say, co-signing a loan for someone. You're not in sin if you do that, but you want to think through it wisely. And at the very least, again, consider the character of a person, the consequences you could suffer, the course of action for repayment, the collateral someone has, and even consider getting some counsel before getting entangled in a legal arrangement like this. Commentator Dwayne Garrett has said this: note that the Bible does not absolutely forbid taking on legal responsibilities for another person. It does, however, here state that risking home and liberty in an enterprise over which one does not have direct control is consummate folly. Although we have little information on Israelite laws of surety, seizure of assets and home, and even the selling of the debtor into slavery were common penalties for failure to make payment, and the cosigner could well have met the same fate. And so in ancient Israel, if you were responsible for another man's debt and that man failed to make his payments, you, the cosigner, could lose assets, you could lose property, possessions, you could lose a home, you could even be sold into slavery, lose your life and the freedoms that you have. Again, Solomon's warning is clear. Don't recklessly enter into an unwise agreement of surety. It's imprudent to bind yourself to an agreement that makes you responsible for another man's financial debt and obligations. And so that's the foolish situation that Solomon is telling his son to avoid. Beloved, it's bad enough when you have to carry your own debt, but to carry another man's debt, well, that's just unwise, completely unwise. Now in verses 3-5, Solomon has a wise solution. He gave us the foolish situation. Now he has a wise solution. If his son does find himself in this situation, makes that mistake, puts his foot in his mouth, opens his big mouth, Solomon now has some advice on how to get out of it. And that's what we see in verses 3-5. Look at what he says. I'll start in verse 1 just so that you can hear the flow. My son, if, Solomon is expressing the condition that a son might find himself in, if you have become surety for your neighbor, have given a pledge for a stranger, if you have been snared with the words of your mouth, have been caught with the words of your mouth, do this then, my son, and deliver yourself, since you have come into the hand of your neighbor. Go, humble yourself, and importune your neighbor. Give no sleep to your eyes, nor slumber to your eyelids. Deliver yourself like a gazelle from the hunter's hand, and like a bird from the hand of the fowler. Now we see, verses 3-5, a logical conclusion, the wise solution to the problem of surety in verses 1 and 2. Solomon provides a fix for reckless and rash co-signing. And he basically says that those who find themselves in a situation like this should do whatever they need to do to free themselves of this obligation and to do it quickly. Solomon says, do this then and deliver yourself. That word deliver literally means to save, to rescue, save yourself, rescue yourself. It's used in the Old Testament to speak of things like deliverance from the hand of the Egyptians. See that in Exodus 18:10. Deliverance from the hand of the Philistines, 1 Samuel 7, verse 3. Deliverance from the hand of an enemy. So these are severe situations. Judges 8:34. It's used all over the Old Testament to speak of liberation from a bad situation. Basically being saved and rescued from a dangerous and difficult situation. And that's how Solomon is using it here. He says, my son, you're in a difficult or dangerous situation. Your circumstances are dire. You have put yourself in a perilous position, and you need to do whatever you need to do to liberate yourself from it. Deliver yourself from this problem. Solomon even views this situation as oppressive and enslaving. Look what he says in the middle of verse 3. Since you have come into the hand of your neighbor. That phrase, into the hand of your neighbor, it means that he is now trapped and under the control of his neighbor. His neighbor owns him, really, in one sense. He's at the mercy of his neighbor. What now happens to him is under his neighbor's control. Solomon's son doesn't have control over his financial future. Maybe not even control over his life, because he could be sold into slavery if he can't pay. He has handed himself over to the debtor, the neighbor, who may in turn throw him into the hands of a creditor, the stranger, or the bank. John Kitchen said it like this: the financial standing, security, and future of Solomon's son are no longer under his own control. He has become the slave of another and is at his mercy. Beloved, that's an unsettling position or place to be in, to have your financial standing and security under the control of someone else. Your financial future is at the mercy of someone else, a debtor no less. And depending on how he goes about paying off his debt will determine how it affects you and impacts your life. If he pays his own debt, great, that's fine. No harm, no foul. But if he doesn't, you're in trouble. You could lose everything, and it could create a financial crisis that lasts for a lifetime. Again, Solomon is warning against putting yourself in this unwise situation. But if you do find yourself in this situation and your mouth has gotten you in trouble, here's the solution that he provides. Solomon says in that third line of verse 3, go, humble yourself, and importune your neighbor. Solomon gives three clear imperatives, three clear commands. Go, humble yourself, and importune your neighbor. The command to go stresses the urgency. Immediate action is required. Swift action, prompt action. Don't sit on this. Don't procrastinate. Don't delay. Don't say to yourself, well, I'll get around to doing it at some point. No. Go right away, immediately, quickly, before it's too late. Then he says, humble yourself. That's an interesting word. Solomon doesn't use the traditional word for humility. He uses a different word, a more intense and a more vivid and graphic word. The word or phrase, humble yourself, literally means to stamp oneself down or to trample oneself. And so the imagery is of a man throwing himself on the ground and then allowing himself to be trampled or walked on. He has placed himself in the dirt to be stepped on. It's a picture of humiliation and shame. And so Solomon says, I want you to go to your neighbor and admit your humiliation and shame in what you have done. Eat crow. Eat humble pie. Humble yourself. Acknowledge that you've made a grave mistake and don't let pride stand in the way so that you can unravel the mess that you've put yourself in. Don't let pride get in the way. Acknowledge that you've done something foolish and stupid and ridiculous and reckless. One commentator said it like this: sprawl face down in the mud and be tramped on. Be walked over like carpet if necessary to get your name off that loan agreement. Crawl like a worm, swallow your pride. When you know that your financial future is at risk because you have made a foolish financial agreement, then have the humility to admit that you've made a mistake. That's really the idea. Don't let pride stand in the way from you going back to your neighbor, because that would be difficult to admit, right? There's an embarrassment there. There's humiliation. There's shame. And then Solomon says this. After he says go and after he says humble yourself, he says, and importune your neighbor. Importune, another interesting word. It means to act stormily or to act boisterously or act boldly. The idea here is that you would storm into the presence of your neighbor, of course, after you've humbled yourself. Boldly appeal to him. Be bold in your approach as you seek to get out of the loan agreement. Implore your neighbor to let you out of this foolish financial situation. Beg him to release you. And really, the idea behind this importune, is don't take no for an answer. By using this word importune, Solomon expects his son to persistently harass his neighbor until he's set free. Maybe even saying to his neighbor, look, put up your own assets, your own property, your own possessions. Do whatever you can to pay it back, but get my name off of this loan agreement. Solomon says you need to get control of your life again. You don't want it under the control of a neighbor or even under the control of a stranger, a bank. Get control of your finances. You need to right your financial wrongs. You need to get yourself off the hook for another man's debt. And you need to do it immediately, humbly, and boldly. I mean, beloved, for Solomon to speak this forcefully, this firmly to his son about this issue, he must know a thing or two about the severe consequences of owning another man's debt. I mean, severe consequences to own another man's debt. Again, it's bad enough when you own your own debt, but to own another man's debt? Just ridiculous. The language that he uses is not light. It's firm. It's strong. Solomon says you need to do everything in your power to get out from this situation. And don't give yourself any rest until you do. Look at what he says next. Verse 4. Give no sleep to your eyes, nor slumber to your eyelids. This is just another way of stressing the urgency, how immediate this needs to be done. Swift action. Don't let a night pass before seeking to be released from this arrangement. Don't rest until your neighbor takes back, or until you take back ownership of your own life, your own finances and resources. Don't leave this unresolved. Give no sleep to your eyes, nor slumber to your eyelids. John Kitchen says it like this: no delay is acceptable. Hesitancy may spell ruin. No personal need is more urgent than the requirement to free yourself from this unwise commitment. Time will not cure this problem nor make it disappear, but can only hasten the potential destruction. Not one night should pass before you exhaust every attempt to extricate yourself from this pledge. Give no sleep to your eyes, no slumber to your eyelids. And then Solomon says this in verse 5. He further highlights the urgent and swift action that must be taken. Deliver yourself like a gazelle from the hunter's hand, and like a bird from the hand of the fowler. With very vivid imagery, and I would say intense language, Solomon urges his son to get out of this financial trap as soon as possible. He uses two similes. Deliver yourself like a gazelle that has been caught in a hunter's hand, and deliver yourself like a bird that has been trapped in a fowler's hand. He uses that word hand twice, indicating the control and power that a hunter and fowler have over their prey. And when a gazelle or a bird are in control of a hunter or fowler, they frantically try to break free. You can almost picture the situation. They're trapped, and what are they doing? They're frantic. They're ruffling their feathers. They're squirming their legs. They're trying to get out of their situation. They struggle and strain valiantly to free themselves from the very thing that has control over them. That's the picture that Solomon wants us to envision. They will spare no effort to escape their situation because they know that it's a matter of life and death for a gazelle or for a bird. If they don't break free, that's it. It's the end. It will lead to their ruin and destruction. And the same holds true for Solomon's son. He is to spare no effort to escape the financial obligations he is entangled in. Because in his case, it is a matter of maybe financial life and death. If he doesn't break free, this agreement could ruin him. And maybe not just ruin him, but again, an entire family, an entire home. Move swiftly like a gazelle. Fly quickly like a bird. Deliver yourself from this perilous predicament. Beloved, Solomon is instructing us to be, one, wise with our words, because that's what he stresses in verse 2. You opened your mouth and you put yourself in this situation. But two, wise with our finances. Your future well-being is impacted by the financial decisions and commitments that you make now. Don't make rash, impetuous, impulsive financial decisions. I think that's the main takeaway that Solomon is stressing here. Don't promise to back someone financially when you don't have the money, or could end up losing a ton of money that would put your future at risk. There's a wise way to go about helping others. Do you need the cosign? Not necessarily. What's a better way to go about doing it? Give. Freely give. You want to help somebody out? Just give generously and don't expect the money to be paid back in return. Give liberally to help a brother out, but don't bind yourself to a financial agreement. Just give freely, generously, give what you can to help someone out, but don't commit to something that you can't afford. And so again, Solomon provides some practical advice on how to manage finances. And next week, we're going to get into that work ethic for that next way of securing a better future. How do you do it? You need to have a strong work ethic. Don't be lazy. We'll get into that next week. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your word. We know that this might be relatable to some and unrelatable to others, but nonetheless helpful when we think about how to manage our money, and this is just one of those ways to do it. I pray that we would be good stewards of all that you have entrusted to us and not make rash and impetuous and impulsive decisions with the things that we have under our control, but to use those things wisely for the good of your kingdom and the growth of your kingdom, even to take care of our own homes and a wife and family and children. We know that you have provided all things for us, but we are to handle those provisions wisely, and I pray that you would help us to do that. I pray that this would be helpful and that we would remind ourselves of these things when maybe we are considering getting into a situation like this, and it would guide us in the way that we go about agreeing to those things. Again, we just pray for wisdom in life so that we can honor you in all things. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.